The Nexus Research Station hung in the void like a crystalline tumor, all geometric angles and pulsing bioluminescent conduits that would have given any self-respecting architect nightmares. It was, according to the 17 different species that had contributed to its construction, a marvel of cooperative engineering. According to anyone with functioning eyeballs, it looked like someone had let a committee of drunk octopi design a space station while arguing about interior decorating. But then again, most things in the Terran Galactic cooperative looked like they'd been assembled by beings who had heard about the concept of aesthetics second-hand and decided to wing it. Emma Hartwell, though most of her colleagues just called her that stubborn human, stood before what the Zelithians insisted on calling the probability visualization matrix. She preferred the future-spoiling machine, which had the dual benefits of being both more accurate and significantly more likely to annoy her supervisors. The device itself resembled a cross between a crystal ball, a particle accelerator, and something that might have been a torture device in a more enlightened civilization. "You realize," chittered the station's head researcher, a Zelithian whose name roughly translated to one who questions the wisdom of bipeds, "that your species' neural architecture is particularly susceptible to temporal displacement syndrome." Emma adjusted her lab coat with the kind of deliberate nonchalance that had gotten her kicked out of 3 previous research positions. "And you realize that particularly susceptible is exactly the kind of thing humans like to take as a challenge, right?" The Zelithian's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or exasperation. With their species, it was hard to tell the difference. "This is precisely why the Council classifies your people as adorably reckless. You approach scientific hazards the way other species approach recreational activities. We prefer enthusiastically curious," Emma said, running her hands over the control interface. The symbols weren't entirely alien anymore. After 6 months of operation, she'd developed an almost intuitive understanding of the machine's language. Or maybe the machine had developed an understanding of hers. With temporal mechanics, cause and effect got a little fuzzy around the edge. The probability engine, as she'd taken to calling it in her reports, much to the dismay of the Zelithian Nomenclature Committee, was theoretically simple. It analyzed current quantum states and extrapolated potential future outcomes, displaying them as semi-tangible holographic scenarios. Think of it as a weather forecast for reality itself. Except instead of predicting rain, it predicted whether your civilization would still exist next Tuesday. The practical applications were staggering. Military strategists could see the outcomes of battles before they fought them. Economists could predict market crashes centuries in advance. Diplomats could negotiate treaties by examining every possible permutation of their proposals. It was the kind of technology that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy, which Emma reflected as she initiated the startup sequence, was probably why they were testing it on humans first. "Beginning standard probability scan," she announced to the observation deck, where a collection of alien dignitaries observed with the kind of polite interest usually reserved for watching someone else's pet perform tricks. "Current focus, potential outcomes of the Andromedan trade negotiation." The machine hummed to life, its crystalline core spinning faster until it became a blur of refracted light. The air around it began to shimmer, reality growing soft around the edges like a photograph left too long in the sun. Then the images began to form. Emma had seen hundreds of probability cascades by now, but they never failed to fascinate her. Ghostly scenarios played out in translucent detail, diplomatic meetings that might happen, trade routes that could be established, wars that thankfully remained theoretical. She watched herself age and die in a dozen different ways, saw the station destroyed by both accident and sabotage, witnessed the rise and fall of empires that existed only in the realm of maybe. But today something was different. Among the swirling possibilities, she caught glimpses of something that made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. A figure in a containment suit standing over rows of unconscious beings, hooked to machines that looked uncomfortably similar to the probability engine. The figure turned, and through the helmet's visor she saw her own face, but older, scarred and wearing an expression of terrible resignation. The vision lasted only a moment before dissolving back into the standard parade of potential futures, but it left Emma with the strangest sensation. Not déjà vu exactly, but something deeper, a memory of something that had never happened but felt absolutely real. Scan complete, she reported, her voice steady despite the chill running down her spine. Standard probability matrix maintained within acceptable parameters. But as she began shutting down the system, Emma found herself remembering details that shouldn't exist. The smell of antiseptic in that underground laboratory, the weight of the containment suit, the names of the test subjects, beings she'd never met but somehow knew intimate. Most disturbing of all, she remembered the conversation she'd had with the Zalithian administrator about expanding the testing program. A conversation that, according to her schedule, wasn't supposed to happen until next week. Emma stared at the now dormant probability engine and felt the first stirring of a horrible suspicion. What if the machine wasn't just showing possible futures? What if it was somehow importing memories from those futures, bleeding probability into reality? And what if she wasn't the operator of this experiment, but its primary test subject? The Zalithian approached her station, his compound eyes reflecting the dying light of the machine. Your biometric readings show elevated stress indicators, Dr. Hart. Perhaps you should consider taking a break from— I'm fine, Emma interrupted. But even as she said it, she was remembering another conversation, in another timeline, where she'd said the exact same words right before everything went to hell. Outside the station's viewports, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, blissfully unaware that somewhere in their midst, a group of scientists was playing with the very fabric of causality itself. And if Emma's growing suspicions were correct, they were about to discover that some experiments had a way of experimenting right back. The universe, it seemed, had developed quite a sense of irony about the whole affair. 3 days later, Emma discovered she wasn't the only one whose brain had apparently decided to freelance as a temporal storage unit. The revelation came courtesy of a chance encounter in the station's hydroponics bay, where she'd gone to escape the increasingly suspicious glances from her Zalithian colleagues. Nothing said we're monitoring your psychological stability quite like having 6 compound eyes track your every movement while pretending to catalog research data. She found him sitting among the tomato plants, staring at nothing with the kind of intensity usually reserved for watching paint dry or contemplating the heat death of the universe. He was human, or mostly human anyway, with the pale complexion and slightly hollow look that marked him as one of the deep space researchers who spent more time with alien technology than Earth gravity. You're remembering things that haven't happened yet, aren't you? She said without preamble. It wasn't really a question. He looked up with startled eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone who couldn't be older than 30. How did you? He stopped, understanding flickering across his features. You've been on the engine. Emma Hartwell, unwilling time memory storage unit, she said, settling down beside him among the plants. And you are? Dr. Aldrich Voss. I was part of the initial testing phase, before they decided humans were interesting enough to warrant extended observation. His voice carried the kind of bitter amusement that came from discovering your species' stubborn curiosity had landed you in yet another cosmic predicament. Been experiencing temporal bleed-through for about 4 months now. Emma felt something click into place, a memory that wasn't hers of meeting Aldrich in what might have been the station's emergency bunker, discussing escape plans while explosions echoed overhead. You remember the rebellion too? Which one? There are at least 17 different scenarios where we end up fighting our way off this station. Aldrich rubbed his temples. Tuesday's rebellion involves hijacking a cargo transport. Thursday's version has us somehow convincing the Andromedan diplomatic corps to stage a coup. My personal favorite is the one where we reprogram the food synthesizers to only produce caffeinated beverages until the administration surrenders. Despite everything, Emma laughed. That's beautifully petty. We're humans. Petty is our superpower. Over the next hour, Aldrich painted a picture that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The probability engine wasn't just a research tool, it was a harvesting operation. The Zalithians, along with several other species, had discovered that certain neural architectures could retain probability memories, essentially turning sentient beings into living databases of potential futures. Think about it, Aldrich explained, unconsciously echoing a lecture Emma remembered him giving in 3 different timeline scenarios. Perfect intelligence gathering. Instead of sending spies or conducting surveillance, you just find someone who remembers a future where the information was already discovered. No risk, no evidence trail, just pure temporal espionage. And they chose humans because we're apparently the cosmic equivalent of temporal sponges. Most species' brains reject probability memories as incompatible data. We just absorb them and keep functioning. Aldrich's expression darkened. Well, mostly functioning. He led her through the station's less monitored sections, introducing her to others who'd been touched by the engine. There was Dr. Yuki Chen, a xenobiologist who now remembered the complete life cycles of species that wouldn't evolve for another million years. Engineer Pavel Kozlov, who could build technology from futures that might never exist. Dr. Amara Okafor, a linguist who spoke languages that would only be invented if certain historical events unfolded in very specific ways. They'd formed what Emma could only describe as the galaxy's most depressed support group. The fascinating thing, Yuki explained as they gathered in an unused storage bay, is how different species handle the temporal contamination. The Andromedan test subject went completely catatonic after 2 sessions. The Regillian subject became convinced they were a prophet, and tried to start a religious movement. The Cetacean representative just kept singing increasingly complex songs about the streams that flow backward. And humans? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew. We complain about it constantly but keep functioning anyway, Pavel said with the resigned pride of someone whose species had turned stubbornness into an art form. Classic human response to cosmic horror: acknowledge it's terrible, make jokes about it, and then figure out how to weaponize it. Emma was beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. It wasn't just scientific research, it was farming. The aliens weren't studying temporal mechanics, they were cultivating a crop of living memory banks. And humans, with their irritating tendency to adapt to literally anything, made perfect subjects. So what's the plan? She asked, settling into the group dynamic with the ease of someone who remembered participating in this conversation at least a dozen times across multiple probability streams. That depends, Amara said, her voice carrying traces of accents from languages that didn't exist yet. On which future we're trying to avoid. I remember at least 8 different scenarios where we successfully escape, 12 where we die horribly, and 3 where we somehow end up running the station ourselves. I vote for option 3, Emma said. Naturally, but first we need to deal with the immediate problem. Aldrich gestured toward the ceiling, where the station's central AI hummed with barely contained processing power. The system is learning. Every time we access probability memories, it analyzes our neural patterns and refines its harvesting technique. We're not just test subjects, we're training data. Emma felt another memory surface standing in this same room, but with different lighting, different conversations, different outcomes. In some of those memories they failed. In others they succeeded but at terrible cost. And in a few, they discovered something that changed everything. There's something else, isn't there? She said. Something you're not telling me. The group exchanged glances, the kind of look shared by people who'd lived through too many variations of the same conversation. The engine isn't just showing us possible futures, Yuki said quietly. It's creating them. Every scenario we observe becomes slightly more likely to occur. We're not just remembering potential realities, we're manifesting them. Emma stared at her new colleagues, feeling the weight of cosmic irony settling over her like a particularly malevolent blanket. The aliens thought they were controlling the future by studying it, but instead they'd created a group of humans who were unconsciously authoring reality itself. So, she said with the kind of calm that preceded either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown, we're not just lab rats, we're unconscious gods with abandonment issues and a grudge against our creators. Pretty much, Aldrich agreed. Welcome to the club. We meet for therapy sessions every Tuesday, assuming Tuesday still exists in whatever timeline we end up creating. Outside their makeshift meeting room, the station continued its orbit around the probability of tomorrow, blissfully unaware that its most successful experiment was about to become its most dangerous problem.
The rebellion began, appropriately enough, with Emma spilling coffee on a control panel. It wasn't intentional, or at least, she was reasonably sure it wasn't intentional in this particular timeline. But as the caffeinated liquid seeped into the probability engine's secondary systems, triggering a cascade of warning lights that would have made a disco jealous, Emma experienced a moment of perfect temporal clarity. She remembered this exact scenario playing out in 43 different ways across 17 probability streams. In most of them, she apologized profusely and helped clean up the mess. In 3 particularly embarrassing versions, she tried to blame it on gravitational fluctuations. But in one specific timeline, the one that felt most real despite never having actually happened, she used the distraction to activate a hidden subbrain that Aldrich had programmed into the system weeks ago. Or would program. Temporal grammar was giving her a headache. Emergency containment protocols activated. announced the station's AI in the kind of cheerfully helpful tone that usually preceded catastrophic system failures. Probability matrix destabilization detected. Initiating lockdown procedure. Emma caught Aldrich's eye across the lab and saw her own grim satisfaction reflected there. Phase 1 of Operation Cosmic Middle Finger was officially underway. The beauty of their plan, and Emma used the term plan loosely, since it consisted mostly of wing it and hope the universe's sense of irony doesn't kill us, lay in their fundamental advantage over their captors. The Zilithians and their allies could predict individual futures, but the humans remembered them all simultaneously. While their opponents played chess, the probability-contaminated humans were playing four-dimensional chess, with pieces that existed in several timelines at once. It was giving everyone involved existential headaches, but it was also remarkably effective. Containment breach in Section 7. Pavel's voice crackled over the comm system. In Timeline 37, he was supposed to say Section 12, but improvisation had always been humanity's specialty, requesting immediate backup. The Zilithian security forces, bless their predictable little compound hearts, responded exactly as Emma remembered they would. Half of them rushed toward the false emergency, leaving the primary research areas understaffed. The other half began implementing standard lockdown procedures that had been designed for every conceivable crisis except the one they were actually facing. "You know," Emma said conversationally to the Zilithian supervisor who was frantically trying to regain control of his systems, "there's something wonderfully poetic about being outsmarted by your own test subject." "This is highly irregular," the alien chittered, his mandibles clicking with agitation. "Human subjects are not supposed to exhibit coordinated resistance behaviors. Your species lacks the necessary hierarchical command structures." For he was interrupted by Yuki's voice over the intercom, speaking in what Emma recognized as pre-classical Andromedan, a language that wouldn't be invented for another 3 centuries but which every probability-touched human on the station had somehow learned fluently. "She's telling the Andromedan diplomatic corps that the Zilithians have been conducting illegal temporal experiments." Emma translated helpfully. "Also something about how this violates about 17 different galactic treaties that won't be ratified until next decade." The supervisor's compound eyes widened in what might have been panic or indigestion. That information is classified at the highest levels. There's no possible way she could know about the secret annexes to the Temporal Non-Interference Accord, or about how you've been selling probability data to the Regillian Intelligence Service." Emma smiled with the kind of innocent expression that had probably gotten humans into trouble since they first climbed down from trees. "Funny thing about remembering futures, sometimes you remember the parts where your secrets get exposed." Throughout the station, the rebellion unfolded with the strange, dreamlike quality of an event that was both inevitable and impossible. Amara convinced the station's AI that it was experiencing a temporal paradox and needed to shut down non-essential systems for recalibration. Pavel somehow managed to reprogram the life support systems to play Earth music at volumes that made productive thought impossible. A tactic that proved surprisingly effective against species whose hearing was more sensitive than human norms. The most surreal moment came when Chen managed to convince a squad of Zilithian security forces that they were actually part of a training simulation. A deception that worked because in Timeline 89 that's exactly what they had been. "This is impossible," the supervisor muttered, watching his carefully ordered research facility descend into what could only be described as organized chaos. "Humans don't have the cognitive capacity to coordinate temporal probability manipulation. Your neural architecture isn't sophisticated enough to. You know what's funny?" Emma interrupted, watching the probability engine's displays flicker through cascading sequences of potential outcomes. "You spent so much time studying our brain architecture. You forgot to study our behavioral patterns. Humans have been turning disadvantages into advantages since we figured out that pointed sticks could kill things bigger than." On the main display, probability streams swirled in increasingly chaotic patterns. Emma could see fragments of different futures bleeding together, timelines where they succeeded, where they failed, where they somehow ended up accidentally conquering half the galaxy while trying to escape. The engine wasn't just showing possibilities anymore. It was actively generating them, each observation creating new branches of reality that split and merged like tributaries in a cosmic river. "The fascinating thing," Aldrich said, appearing beside her with the casual timing of someone who'd lived through this conversation multiple times, "is that we're not actually trying to escape. We're trying to prove a point. which, that free will is a lot more complicated than your average galactic civilization wants to admit. He gestured toward the chaos around them. You can predict individual choices, but you can't predict the emergent behavior that arises from those choices interacting with each other, especially when some of those choices are being made by beings who remember multiple versions of the same decision. The station shuddered as Pavel's sabotage reached the artificial gravity generators, causing everyone to experience the unique sensation of existing in 6 different orients. Emma found herself remembering a physics lecture she'd never attended about how temporal mechanics interacted with relativistic effects, delivered by a professor who wouldn't be born for another 2 centuries. Hartwell, the Zelithian supervisor said, his voice carrying a note of desperate authority, you must realize that what you're doing threatens the stability of local spacetime. The probability cascade is approaching critical mass. If you continue this course of action, we'll create a temporal paradox that either destroys the station or transforms it into something unprecedented. Emma finished. Yeah, we know. We remember. The question is, are you willing to bet the stability of your research program on the assumption that humans won't risk cosmic annihilation to prove a philosophical point? The alien stared at her with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering that your pet goldfish had somehow learned to pilot spacecraft. Around them, reality continued to hiccup as probability streams cascaded through increasingly unlikely scenarios. In one timeline they were already free, in another, they were all dead. In a particularly strange branch, they'd somehow convinced the galactic community to establish a new branch of science, dedicated to studying human stubbornness as a fundamental force of nature. Emma found herself grinning as she watched the futures multiply and diverge. They might be lab rats, but they were lab rats who'd figured out how to reprogram the maze while running through it. The universe, she reflected, was about to learn why humans had never met a problem they couldn't make significantly more complicated. The probability engine died with all the dramatic flair of a soap opera villain, which is to say it took forever, involved a lot of sparking and ominous humming, and absolutely nobody was convinced it was actually gone until the credits rolled. Emma stood in the wreckage of what had once been the galaxy's most ambitious temporal research facility, surrounded by the kind of devastation that occurred when reality decided to have an existential crisis. Broken probability matrices littered the floor like the remnants of shattered crystal balls, while overhead, emergency lighting cast everything in an appropriately apocalyptic red glow. Well, Aldrich said, surveying the destruction with the satisfied air of someone who'd remembered this exact moment happening at least 47 different ways, that could have gone worse. How exact? Pavel asked, extracting himself from beneath a control panel that had apparently decided to relocate itself 3 meters to the left during the final probability cascade. In timeline 63, the station imploded into a temporal singularity. In 92, we accidentally created a duplicate Earth, populated entirely by very confused dinosaurs. And in my personal favorite, timeline 118, we somehow triggered a cosmic event that made every sentient being in the galaxy simultaneously develop an irresistible urge to write poetry about their feelings. Emma found herself laughing despite everything, or maybe because of everything. When you'd lived through enough variations of catastrophic failure, there was something liberating about finally achieving catastrophic success. The aftermath had been as chaotic as the rebellion itself, but with significantly more paperwork. The Galactic Cooperative's response had been swift, predictable, and utterly befuddled by the unprecedented nature of what they were dealing with. How do you prosecute someone for crimes that technically occurred across multiple probability streams? How do you conduct a trial when half the evidence consists of memories of events that never happened? The solution, reached after considerable diplomatic hand-wringing, and what Emma suspected was a significant amount of alcohol consumption by the decision-makers involved, was to classify the entire incident as an unfortunate temporal anomaly, with unexpectedly positive research outcomes. Translation: they were sweeping the whole mess under the cosmic rug and hoping nobody important would notice. The irony, Yuki observed, picking through the remains of her xenobiology equipment, is that they got exactly what they wanted, just not how they wanted it. She wasn't wrong. The destruction of the probability engine had created something unprecedented in galactic history, a small group of beings who existed in a state of quantum temporal superposition, simultaneously remembering multiple possible versions of their own lives. They were living probability distributions, conscious entities who straddled the line between what was and what might be. The scientific community was beside itself with excitement. The philosophical implications alone had triggered 3 separate conferences, 2 minor religious movements, and 1 very heated academic dispute about whether they technically counted as a new form of life. Dr. Hartwell came a familiar chittering voice from behind her. The Zilithian supervisor, whose name she'd learned was actually something like distinguished researcher of improbable outcomes, approached with the careful gait of someone who wasn't entirely sure which version of reality they were currently inhabiting. "Let me guess," Emma said without turning around. "The Galactic Science Council wants to study us. Among others, the Andromedan Philosophical Society has declared you all living embodiments of quantum uncertainty. The Regilian Empire is convinced you're either prophets or weapons, and the Cetacean Consortium has composed a 17-hour song cycle about your journey through the streams of maybe." Emma finally turned to face him, noting with amusement that his compound eyes kept tracking slightly different focal points, probably seeing multiple probability versions of her simultaneously. "And what do you think we are?" The alien's mandibles clicked in what she'd learned to recognize as contemplation. "I think you are something that should not exist according to our understanding of temporal mechanics, consciousness, and basic causality. I also think you are the most important discovery in galactic history. Flattery will get you nowhere. We're not going back into any machines. I would not ask you to. The research value of your current state far exceeds anything we could learn from further experimentation." He paused, then added with what might have been humor, "Also, the insurance premiums for studying humans have become prohibitively expensive." Over the following months, as the affected individuals adjusted to their new existence, patterns began to emerge. They found they could consciously access specific probability memories when needed, though doing so for extended periods caused headaches that felt like temporal jet lag. They developed an uncanny ability to predict short-term outcomes, not through prescience, but through remembering similar situations that had played out differently in other timelines. Most importantly, they discovered that their condition was, in its own strange way, liberating. When you remember every possible version of your life, the weight of individual decisions becomes both infinitely heavier and remarkably lighter. Every choice mattered because you could see all its consequences, but no single choice was catastrophic because you remembered alternatives where different paths had led to similar destinations. "We're like walking thought experiments," Amara mused during one of their regular meetings. They'd taken to gathering in the station's observation lounge, partly for the view and partly because it was the one place where the probability distortions didn't make the local space-time hiccup. "Living paradoxes," Pavel agreed. "We exist in violation of several fundamental principles of causality, which makes us either cosmic aberrations or the next step in conscious evolution." "Why not both?" Emma suggested. "Humans have always been good at being multiple contradictory things simultaneous." The response from Earth had been typically human, a mixture of pride, concern, and immediately wanting to figure out how to replicate the effect for practical applications. The military was interested in their strategic implications. The scientific community wanted to understand their theoretical foundations. The entertainment industry had already optioned their story for 17 different media adaptations. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the broader galactic community. For the first time since joining the cooperative, humans weren't seen as the cute primitive species that occasionally did something unexpectedly clever. They were recognized as something genuinely unprecedented beings, whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, time, and reality itself. "You know what's fun?" Emma said, watching the stars wheel past the viewport in patterns she remembered from a dozen different timelines. "They thought they were making us into better test subjects. Instead, they made us into something that transcends the need for testing." "How so?" Aldrich asked. "We don't need to predict the future anymore. We remember it, all of it, every possible version." She smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had seen their own story play out in countless variations and had chosen which ending to make real. "We're not laboratory children anymore. We're the children of maybe itself, and we get to decide which maybe becomes reality." Outside the station, the galaxy continued its ancient dance, unaware that somewhere in its midst small group of transformed humans had become living embodiments of one of its most fundamental principles, that the universe was not a fixed thing but a continuously unfolding possibility space, where consciousness and choice shaped reality itself. The aliens had tried to harvest the future, but instead they'd cultivated gardeners who could plant it, and the universe, with its infinite capacity for ironic justice, was apparently quite pleased with how that particular experiment had turned out.